Welcome to Kingdomize, the podcast, where we discuss how to see our lives and our world through a kingdom lens, how to infuse kingdom culture into our families, our workplaces, and our cities, as we all participate in the dream of Jesus to see his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. So thanks for joining us again today on Kingdomize, the podcast. We are in our Solutionaries series. We have been having a great time talking about revolutionaries that are bringing solutions, real-world solutions, kingdom on earth as it is in heaven, just like Jesus said. And so today we're excited to have with us Stuart Bell. Stuart Bell is here. And gentlemen, just so you know, Ian, when you and I did the introduction to this series, we started playing around with the Beatles song. I don't know if you remember that. The Beatles song.
I do.
You say you want a revolution, and you actually sang for us. I don't know if you want to sing for us.
No, let's not repeat
right.
that. Let's not.
I agree with you. That's the best choice. But again, I just want to remind us of, because we have another great Brit with us, Stuart, here. But the first line, the second verse says, "To say you've got a real solution, we'd like to see the plan." And I think the Beatles maybe wrote that, 60 years ago for this time. We'll see what's happening. So I think the time we're living in is not much different than the 60s with everything going on in the world and stuff. So this will be fun. Stuart, again, excited to be meeting you for the first time. You and Ian have tons of history, but you're an influencer, a speaker, an author. You've started churches. You've started a network. I'm going to let Ian really bring more of that in, but really excited to have you here. And I'm just going to throw it over to Ian to talk a little bit about who you are and some of your history. So we're glad you're here. Ian, I'm glad you're here. Stuart, I'm glad you're here. This is going to be great.
Great, thank you.
Hey, thanks, Brian. Look, absolutely delighted, Stuart, that you are with us today. I think before we started, we said we'd probably go back 40 years.
Yeah.
And spoke at the church that you founded, spoke at it was called Grapevine then, it's called The One Event for numbers of years. And just have met on and off during that time when I needed help, wisdom, insight, and I managed to get that from you. And so that was one of the reasons why I said to Brian, it'd be absolutely fantastic to have Stuart on our call. He's a seasoned leader. He walks the talk, he talks the walk. So I'm absolutely delighted that we could have this time together, and some of the benefits that I've actually received over numbers of years, would love our listeners to get some of that. And so, Stuart, maybe you could just tell us a little bit of your story so we get your background, some of your spiritual formation, some of your mindset that has brought you to where you are now.
Great. Well, firstly, thank you for the invitation and for the kind words. It's good to connect up. But I suppose that 40-year period is quite a useful one, because it is around 40 years ago that, actually before that, I was involved in music with British Youth for Christ and used to travel around a lot. And what we found was that there was a lot of interest in Jesus, but it was quite difficult to then connect people in any kind of discipleship into church life. And so we found that a lot of people, young people particularly, were coming to faith. And what happened in the city where I live in, Lincoln, was that we did some evangelism into local schools. And out of that, I think around 30 young people made a decision to follow Christ. And we naively invited them to the church that we attended on the following Sunday, which was a Methodist church. And two things happened, of course. The first was that the people in the church weren't too happy with a group of young people who didn't yet know how to behave, coming in, sitting on the back row. But the second thing, of course, was that the hour was always an hour's worship that felt a lot longer than that, as you can imagine. Group of young people said, what we had shared with them in terms of the gospel they were happy with, but in terms of attending church, they weren't too comfortable. So basically, I went to the minister and said, we've got a little bit of a problem. How would you feel if we took this small group in some kind of discipleship process before introducing them into the wider church. And so, with the permission of the local minister, they allowed us the minister's vestry on a Monday evening, and about 15 of these young people came, which was great. But if anyone knows anything about English Methodist vestries, it was damp and smelt of gas, which meant it wasn't too conducive to a good meeting. And so, again, with the permission of the Methodist Church, we started to meet in our home on a Friday evening. And we set about with a very simple program. We sang the latest sort of Christian songs, which usually had 3 chords attached, simple stuff, and then studied the Bible. And interestingly, started with the Acts of the Apostles, I remember. And so we had this small group, and it wasn't long before they started to bring friends. And actually, because we were studying scripture together and these young people were so interested in finding out things, the questions were asked. Why is church life so different today than it was then? There was obviously a power involved in the gospel then. Why don't we see it? And out of those discussions, we had a remarkable evening when they pressed me to pray for them to be filled with the Holy Spirit. Now, this was all new to me. I mean, I'd met some Pentecostals, but they frightened me to death at the beginning. But we simply prayed, and most of them were filled with the Spirit, started to speak in tongues, and there was this, we were taken by surprise, basically. And so what happened then, friends, they began to bring friends. We would have loads of kids in our home, not just for the meeting, but they'd come at all times. And we decided that we would knock a wall down in our home. Literally got a builder to knock a wall down in our home to get all the kids in. Some remarkable conversions. And it wasn't long before the pressure pushed us into what I would now say was an accidental planting of a church, because we hired a hall and tried to do that under the authority of the Methodist Church, but in those days there didn't seem to be a way that we could do that. And so we started meeting, and within a 7-year period, I think we grew to around 120, most of them brand new converts, most of them young. And to be honest, I would have been very comfortable with that, because as they developed and grew, started to marry them and all of this kind of stuff, really enjoyed the pastoral side. And then again, reading in the Acts of the Apostles one day, because I was brought up with the concept that be suspicious of anything big, small and relational is the way to build. And yet, on the day of Pentecost, I suddenly saw this 120 in the upper room, and then 3,000 are added. And it was like a light bulb moment where I began to understand that, yes, it's great to have a little group in your home, but is there something beyond that God was calling us to? And so, step by step, we examined that. And again, within those early years, people started to contact us from the region saying, is there any way that you'd be interested in planting a church in our location? And so I think in those early days, we must have planted about 15 churches in the territory, because we got this kind of geographic vision. There are two areas of water. One's the River Humber, and then the area of the Wash on the east side of England. And we kind of put together this concept of, we want to see a cell. In those days, it was the 3 C's. We want to see a cell in every village, a congregation in every town, and a celebration in every city between the Humber and the Wash. And that's where we got that ground level vision. And so 2 things happened in parallel, really. One was the planting of a local church. The second was a planting out into a region. And then we came across new churches, as they were called. Well, they were called house churches originally. And we came across people that had gone further than us. And so we got help, and we formed a ground level church network leadership team. And also I operated as pastor in the local church. And then, to cut a very long story short, because of this vision to see the bigger and the cities impacted and territory changed, if you like, and transformation issues, which came slowly, I suppose, over that period of time, because I'd been brought up in a kind of a maintenance kind of mentality where you kind of oversaw decline as carefully as you could. We shifted gears from that kind of idea to the advancing of the kingdom of God. And so that I think the Lord helped us with that. And part of that process meant that the church that we planted, which we called Lincoln Free Church, because we didn't know what to call it. We lived in Lincoln. We wanted to be free, so we called it Lincoln Free Church.
That is profound, Stuart. Well done.
Thank you.
I love that.
And then we joined with a local Assemblies of God church, which Ian will know of, with some good leaders, a couple of men that were known across the country, a man called John Shelbourne and John Phillips. And the two churches came together, which is a story in itself, because I think, as we understand, sometimes we use the same language but mean different things. And so, with all change, I think there's struggle. But during that period of time, we saw a strategic church planted. So, Lincoln Free Church joined with a church called Evangel Church and became New Life Christian Fellowship. And then over 10 years ago, we changed the model again and became a multi-site church. And so now a live church is a church in 6 locations within our area. So that's kind of potted history of 40 years.
No, that's really good. So, Stuart, you were kind enough to endorse the book we just wrote right here. Yep. And in that, we talk about our personal stories of how we went from, I love how you put it, typical church, managing those we lose. I love that. Yeah. To, well, now we're thinking differently, like transformation, being solutionaries. What was the process for you in that? Like, how were you thinking about that? Where did you hear the information? Or was it, I read the Bible and there's the book of Acts again doing this? Or was it influence from others? What was that process for you?
Yeah, I think all of what you said would be true. I think I, like many, made the shift from thinking that the gospel was very personalized, receive Jesus as your personal savior and you go to heaven, to shifts then that, although that's part of the story, that actually the whole God story from creation, fall, right the way through the scriptures, and the revelation of new heavens, new earth, new creation. I think for the first part of my ministry, it was more the classic evangelist approach to see people come to faith. But then the shift to, and I think understanding that the ministry is for the equipping of the saints, all followers of Christ, for the work of the ministry, which was not just defined as church ministry, but ministry into the world, so the classic spheres or mountains that others have spoken of, whereby the equipping of people to be teachers and health workers and so on. And I suppose some of the help has come both from practitioners and also from theologians. Mm-hmm. So I would think N.T. Wright has been quite an influence in my life, in that if I want a good read, you know that there's some things you can get your teeth into with his writings. And I found some of that shift from the classic receive Jesus, go to heaven, to no, this is a bigger picture. It's to do with training for reigning. We used to use that as a phrase years ago, but I hadn't a clue what it meant. And I'm not sure that I'm fully aware now, but I think the thing that is impressing me more lately is often the transformation message often is to do with things we are doing. When I think the dimension of a shift in the belief that transforming people in terms of who they are, transformation of thinking, I think we've been good at certain things in our teaching, but behavioral shifts have not always been there. Some of the most awkward and unhelpful people I know are Christians. And so I think that again, Pentecostals, charismatics have tended to emphasize gifts of the Spirit, rightly so, and I think I want to keep endorsing those. But I also think the fruit of the Spirit and consistent lives, and if you like, Sermon on the Mount as an example, I would see today more as these are the kind of people that God is looking for the future, who properly are examples, if you like, of what humankind are meant to be. And so I think I'm still in a shift of thinking, transformation of mind issues, equipping people for the workplace, and also believing that, as in the history of the UK, God raises up certain people who bring transformation into the world in which we live. And of course, the classic for most Brits would quote perhaps the Clapham group of people, William Wilberforce, etc., who weren't just saying, pray a prayer and get into heaven. They were saying, we want to see our world changed. We want to see justice issues. We want to see the love of God permeating into society in a real, practical, and physical way. And so that demarcation that perhaps I was brought up with, the sacred and sacred, I don't think that way, try not to think that way. Everything belongs to the Lord, etc. So the word everything now, I think, is quite important because I am hopeful for the future that more of us that begin to speak this kind of language and kingdomize our thinking, that actually takes the church from just being a place you attend to an equipping for life and a preparation for the days that are ahead.
Stuart, in that journey, like we've all had the journey, and we're all still on the journey in reality. I mean, I found early in my journey, it was really hard to articulate that salvation was larger than the individual getting saved or being prepared for, for the, I lost quite a lot of friends. I lost quite a, so, you had a network, you had hundreds of leaders. So in your process, like, how did you manage to bring them along this kind of new revelation that you had? How did you manage to do that?
Yeah, I think the word process and patience is quite important. And also exposing our leaders to some great people that can help. I've connected quite a bit with the Everything Network. David and Philippa Stroud, you may know those names.
I know those names, but I don't know the network, Stuart.
Okay, well, it would be really good to hear about them, because Philippa Stroud is actually a member of the House of Lords. And so both of them came out of the New Frontier Network, Terry Virgo's place, a number of years ago. And they have articulated and focused on, they've been in local church leadership, but now I think are focusing on this everything message and are beginning to gather the movers and shakers that are Christians that are wanting to influence society. And so again, it's very, very relational, but they're gathering people that are influential in various spheres, health workers, but people that are not only doing a good job, but they're able to change the way things are done. So educators and so on. And they're gathering them together, having meals together, sharing best practice, etc. together. And so as a network, we've exposed our leaders to some of that kind of thinking and actually partner with them as an organization. One thing I think that we knew from day one was our limitations. And so, and I'm not suggesting other new church networks were wrong, but we wanted, I think, to partner more with organizations and ways of thinking, rather than thinking, we will do it all. So even at Grapevine, I think you would know, Ian, that we always welcomed in speakers from other kinds of networks. So, we would have denominational leaders, people like Nicky Gumbel from HTB come and speak. And I think, answering your question, with our network was the exposing of thinking beyond just our small world and hearing stories which are really interesting. And in fact, the one thing I think that God's opened up for Irene and myself is connectedness beyond the new church network type of situation. So, for instance, Irene and I found ourselves in a meeting recently in London with 250 Anglicans that are looking at how they're working through some of the pressures within the Anglican scene in England. And so I think unity has always been big with us, and that's possibly why it's opened a few doors, to be able to connect with others. And I think also because I'm not the powerful, charismatic figure, I think we've had access because we're able to facilitate things rather than come over as we know it and we can show you what to do. I think some of my weaknesses has helped with that process, if I'm really honest.
I would say, Stuart, is your humbleness and not your weakness, right? I think that's been incredibly attractive for me and for other people. And going back to the Philippa Stroud, she has a significant role in that arc event.
Yes, she does. She does, yeah.
Okay, so so the name came back to me. I was at that in earlier in the year, and so that's amazing. That is absolutely amazing that they've done that. But that's awesome. Well, thank you for that.
It's really developing well. If there's a couple that God's using at this time, I would say they're doing a wonderful job, and again in a very humble way, which is great.
And I mean, coming out of New Frontiers, they would have probably a strong DNA for local church, and so they're not going to be flying off some crazy corner.
Yeah, well, it's only recently that David has handed on the local leadership of the church that he was pastoring. So, yeah, to be honest, everything we do, we would still see the local church as, the foundation of all that we're doing. And are nervous of just organizations that kind of are out there but not connected or accountable anywhere.
Yeah. So, Stuart, just like to get some of your wisdom in terms of you built a very strong, powerful, effective network with, my observation, not just leaders coming together, but leaders supporting one another, shouting each other on. Like you built a community more than an organization with ground level, and I kind of observed that for many years. But the thing I was interested in is, what did you feel when you came to the point where you needed to transition the leadership to Paul Benger and others? Like, what brought you to that point, and what was your process to see that come to fruition?
Well, Irene says that I've been thinking about transition since I was 30. So we try not to use the T word too much in our family now. But the reason I think there's some truth in that is that I've always recognized the importance of bringing new leaders through. And so in the Alive local setting, actually in the second of the transitions, and I'll come back to your question in a minute or two, but in Alive, we've actually released a team to oversee Alive. There is a leader attached, but that team are really people, I still see them as young leaders, though they're in their 40s now, but they've been with me a long time. And so that transition situation has just been a fairly natural, we've been together for a long time, and there's an appropriate time to hand things on. And it's not dissimilar with ground level, actually. And because Paul Benger was executive pastor in Alive for some years and has been alongside me in a very serving role, if you like, for a long time. I think transition for me has to do with the issues of trust, of patience, and of timing. And so, if you ask me how I'm feeling at the moment, you'll get mixed messages because, and back to N.T. Wright, of course, Irene started ordering lots of books for me to read in case I got bored, handed on leadership. But I think the way that I view it, it's amazing how you communicate as carefully as you can and you say, look, we're not retiring, we're staying in the mechanisms. You know, we believe in generational transitions, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're staying in ministry, handing on leadership and responsibilities, but staying focused on God's work. And the very next question is, so what's it like to retire? Of course, we're not using the word retire at all because at this stage in my life, the last thing I want to do is stop doing the good stuff of church and kingdom. And I do think actually there's a fair bit of ageism in the UK, not in other parts of the world, because we have people in my office in various parts of the world that are a fair bit older than myself. So, but it is important to get the timings, and also I think if I have some helpful stuff, it is because I've been involved with 3 or 4 transitions that I helped with that didn't go well the first time round, and so you learn, don't you? And
Yes.
so, one of the things that I think could be a help is communicate really strongly, clearly, and often, and also deal with details. So, what we've said to those that we've handed on to is it's the small things that matter. You know, it's one thing to be honoured on a platform, which all of the guys have always honoured, Irene and myself, sometimes embarrassingly so, you know, as though we're these wonderful, you know, saintly leaders, etc. And we appreciate that. But it's what happens, a month later, 2 months later, because I think too many senior leaders have become a little bit disillusioned because they found themselves in a vacuum. Nobody checked how they were doing. Everybody assumed they were fine. You know, some people even have the idea that transition is one leader leads, the next one is in and sweeps the thing clean and gets on with the new thing. In fact, Irene and I attended the Bishop of Lincoln, 2 bishops back, invited us to his final meeting. And they were having a celebration, which basically meant you had a little glass of champagne and a bit of cake. And he said to me, "This is likely the last time you'll see me." So I said, "Well, why is that?" He said, "Well, when I go to the doors of the cathedral, I turn to face the congregation and wave." He said, "That's the last you will see of me." I said, "Well, that sounds a little bit harsh." And he said, "No, in our system, I can't come back into the cathedral. It's a new day, new thing." And actually encouraged to be as far away as possible and start another life, which is normally the classic retirement. You know, he's done his. And I'm not well. I think I am saying that that's not the best practice. And so, for some people who are unable to be to let others lead, sometimes they have to move on. But my hopes are, and it's a bit early days to say whether this is working or not, but I'd like to be in a place where we're not corks in the bottle in any kind of way, but the shift means that we're now there to support and serve the new leadership as it moves forward. And I think we're doing that okay, but there are frustrations involved, you know, because sometimes it's what's not said rather than what is said. Sometimes it's the small things. So in the last transition we've done, we've said, you know, what about access to the buildings? You know, do we still have fobs to get in through the doors? You know, what do you feel about parking and things like that? Because we've only a small car park. And so even silly adjustments like we now have to get a bus or pay for parking for certain times of the. When you've done a thing for 40 years and change comes in small things, there are mornings you wake up and think, why have we done this? But I think the compelling vision of seeing the next generation pick up the reins, move forward without excluding us from that story. I'd like to think we can achieve that, which means, at the moment, I meet every month with the guy that's leading the team in Lincoln at his request. Now, that's very important to me. Too many times, I think, in new church circles, they would never say this is the case, perhaps, but rules and regulations and, authority is a very interesting thing, isn't it? You only have authority if it's given you. And to try and get it is not the way forward from my point of view. And therefore, and it's early days, but I think we will do some good transitioning. Firstly, if I'm able to sit on my hands a bit more and not speak as quickly. And secondly, if our gifts and what we have built over 40 years is recognized by those that have taken it on. Those things, when those two things come together, I think it's quite potentially successful.
Stuart, I guess when you're in the primary seat, you have access to all kinds of information, leadership, nuances, but sometimes the transition sometimes is more difficult for our wives who they have, supported us, championed us, picked up the mess, consoled us, and whatever, through the ups and downs. Like, how has it been for Irene, if that's not too much of a,
she's
detailed question?
Out of hearing at the moment, which could be useful. So I think you've hit exactly a major issue, and partly certainly to do with people of my age, the shift that has taken place in my lifetime with regard to ministry, women in leadership, etc., because about half of the new church networks were very male dominated. And now, with younger women coming through, it is difficult for wives who have had to make that shift and over a period of time suddenly coming to a time when they would love to be, still involved, feeling a little bit as though younger women are given far more space than they were. So actually, our desire is, and Irene's come in the room now, so she could actually add to this, but our desire is to be kind of mums and dads in the church.
Beautiful.
And grandchildren to the children. There's nothing better, I think, than the family picture for church in terms of, and again, English family life, is not always modelled well in terms of generational connections. And sometimes other nations do it better in that, there's the age actually means experience, and there are values with that. In fact, we've had since COVID an influx, as many churches have, of different nations. And so it might surprise you in rural Lincolnshire, in our central location, we have 46 different nations represented.
Wow.
Which is fantastic. But 100 plus of those are perhaps Nigerians. Now, when I started to talk about transition, they came to me suggesting I'd perhaps not heard the word of the Lord because in Nigeria and other African nations and parts of India, one would expect that seniority was not a thing to avoid, but to embrace. And some of their leaders will be in their 80s. And the interesting thing here to ponder over is that some of the latest research, I think, suggests that the best years and the most useful years are now between 60 and 70. That's the first bracket. And secondly, between 70 and 80. Now, English churches don't think that way at all. As I'm now 74, which feels weird, but inwardly, of course, you don't feel that much different. And it is important you have people around you that tell you the truth. So there are certain people that I think know me well enough that if I'm missing it, rambling on Sundays, dribbling when I eat at the table, you want people to to be able to tell you those things, because it is possible that leaders linger far too long. But I think we should have transitions that remove responsibility from the older founding leaders and new people come through to lead. But we should value their expertise, experience, and long term way of thinking. So I'm only saying that because I'm getting older. But I think it's true.
So I'm going back to Irene. So you would say that she is handling the transition as well as you seem to be handling it very well, right? Is Irene handling it as well
Well,
as you?
I heard a little laugh when you said I'm handling it well. I think we're handling things well, but I do think we are, and I think it's inevitable, but we are facing frustrations within our own thinking on things and the reshaping of our lives, because I think we're still very busy, and hopefully I've not been driven as a leader, but to wake up in the morning and know you're not going into the church office and so on. And I think back to this thought of we long to be invited in. We long to be in people's lives still. I think I found it helpful. You know that story of Elisha where the prophets come and say, the place where we are is too limited. Let's go, and get some wood and build a new place. And the prophet says, go. But then the young prophets say to Elisha, will you come with us? And that's what I believe is happening in our lives. So the shift has taken place. I'm no longer leading. And therefore, it's inevitable, actually, I think, Ian, that I'll go on a Sunday and think, I wouldn't have done that. It's inevitable, I think, when something's perhaps not addressed, where I'm thinking something should have been said. And I think, coming back to Irene, I think her main gifts have been more to do with discernment and things behind the scenes. And she's quite reticent on platforms, although she's good on platforms.
Yeah.
But I think what we have to be careful of is that we talk out our inner frustrations with one another, which then doesn't help either of us. Ultimately, has to be. I think you have to have places to talk things through, talk things out. And that's why I think we started by saying our journey was all to do with strong relationships. And
Yeah.
I think that's still the case. So we still want conversation with those that we've brought through. One of our leaders recently in this transition actually put some questions down for me and said, if you were now where I am, what would you be doing different? And I said to him, that's a fabulous thing for you to say to me, because it gives me permission to say a few things. And yet it's not imposing. So the longer those things happen, I think the better. And also, the more comfortable we become with the new structures, the less we'll be watching and getting niggled over small things that don't seem to be happening. Hopefully, interestingly, when I no longer had to oversee the what was Grapevine and then one event and now is Awaken, the day after praying for Paul and Jeannie, the new leadership there, it's a subjective thing, but I literally felt weight taken off my shoulders.
Beautiful.
I just felt released, because when you've led a thing like that for 40 years and you've had winds that have come through, you've had accidents. On one occasion, stands collapsed and we had 23 people in hospital. And I remember there was a big thing on when a strong wind came through and turned over caravans. It became was this God's judgment? Was it just natural wind? Was it God's judgment? All of that stuff I don't have to handle now. I can just say, Paul, that's up to you now to sort out. I think that the release from responsibility is a good thing. which gives me more time for thinking and for praying and for reading. And my hopes are my last years will be productive, but in a different way.
Sure.
Yeah.
Look, Stu, we're almost coming to the end here, but we love to ask this one question, and that is, what is the best question you've never been asked?
I think that in itself is a great question. I've pondered over it to try and find something really clever to say. But it'd be interesting for the question, what must I do to inherit eternal life, might be a useful one. I've had questions very close to that. But the thought being, when the rich young ruler came to Jesus and said, what must I do? There's been this whole thing within the Christian faith of, we are saved by grace, we don't have to do, etc. I think it's great to be asked the question, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Love to share the gospel at that point, that grace, receive Jesus by faith, etc. But now start a journey where you will be productive for the kingdom, where there will be elements of doing, but there will be sacrifice, and there will be, living out a new life. And so to be given permission, if you like, to do that. One story where that almost happened exactly like that. So I may have been asked the question in a slight way. I had the honour of doing a Bible study in the House of Commons. A good story to conclude with. And I was really nervous about it because the bit that I was nervous about was the questions at the end, because you had to give space for the questions. And they asked me to do 2 weeks, 2 sessions, and I went for 2 weeks to do them on the book of Nehemiah, which has been a favourite book of mine. And so I was told that halfway through your talk, you'll hear a bell ring, you're halfway through, but make sure you leave 5 minutes for questions at the end. So I did my talk, and of course, being brought up a Methodist, I wasn't too worried that there seemed to be no response. Nobody smiled. I wasn't sure whether they were liking me, listening, or whatever. But, I carried on, did my little talk. And then a member of the House of Lords asked me this question. In the light of what you have shared, what should I do? Which is very similar to that question. And I was amazed that she asked that question. And thankfully, I just went to some of the things we've chatted a little bit about. I said, you've got a position and a place that very few people will have. And your influence in the life of the land is considerable. And therefore, now I talked a little bit about William Wilberforce and the shifts that took place. And I said, my hopes are that you would commit to a local church and be released fully into the ministry. But the ministry is what you're called to in the House of Lords. I chatted round that. And she seemed to be happy with the answer, so I was happy. But I think we are in a time, aren't we, when questions are very, very important. And I think we're hearing in the UK, aren't we, of a quiet revival at the moment, which I do genuinely think is happening, and particularly with young men. Bibles, more Bibles are being bought today than for a long, long time. And there's a generation coming through that are asking lots of questions at the moment and are coming to faith. And so I really do have hope for the future that we may be on a bit of a tide turn in our land, which would be wonderful.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
Stuart, this has been absolutely fantastic. Honestly, absolutely fantastic. Really always appreciated your heart, appreciated your wisdom in what you've shared, your experiences. Absolutely fabulous. In closing, if people want more of Stuart, how do they do that?
Well, just tell them I'm not retired. That'll do. But I do have a number of books that kind of carry something of the message that I've carried. One is to do with the book of Nehemiah. So rebuilding the walls. So Amazon, rebuilding the walls. Also some material on Paul's letters to the Corinthians. That's called sane spirituality, because I actually think when Paul addresses the Corinthian church, it's so much like the things we've been speaking of, that the world was a stronger influence on the church than the church on the world. And I think what we've got to do is shift that, so that instead of Christians being influenced by the culture, Christians have got to begin to be culture changers and reshape things. So there's a few books out there. There's also a book I would recommend by Justin Brearley, which is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. That's worth a read for people that are a bit skeptical about, is the church growing? Are there some good news stories out there? That's a book of hope, I think. And then, of course, I could be contacted through Alive, so I've still got an email there, stuart@alivechurch.org.uk, where I'd be happy to answer any questions from this podcast.
Beautiful.
Okay.
Beautiful.
Excellent. Gentlemen, this has been fantastic. And Stuart, as you were talking there, I was thinking of the mayor that we work with really closely here in our city. And he used to, in this dialogue about your faith and your personal belief and then how it comes out in your city or community, he always brought us back to a prayer of Sir Thomas More, which was, give us, good Lord, the grace to work for the things we pray for. And he would always remind us that this is a both and I've heard that coming from you all day, which is fantastic. So guys, it's amazing. Thank you again. Ian, good job. Good to see you, buddy. Stuart, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
We could talk for hours. The wisdom that you have and experience is fantastic. And I agree with you. You're not retired. There's lots in there and lots more to give to the kingdom, you and Irene both. So we bless you. And thanks for listening today. If you've been here for the time, appreciate you listening to our podcast. While you're there, why don't you click that like button, subscribe, share this with somebody else. This would be very helpful for people in transition. It's such a great experiential / practical discussion. Really important. So again, thanks for tuning in today. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Solutionaries on Kingdomize the podcast.
Thanks for joining us today on Kingdomize the podcast. Let's keep the discussion going throughout the week on our socials or on our website, kingdomizeglobal.com. Contact us today to see how we can walk together to see more of God's kingdom in your city as it is in heaven.